Well, that tax is a competitive advantage. It's part of your war chest. It's part of what you have to do. But I understand another area where we fail very bad, and we have seen that you've done very well, apart from having a low tax rate and simplified systems to pay tax, is infrastructure.
Yes.
Latin American countries keep saying, Panama in particular, talking about doing things, but when you see how little money is being put in infrastructure, it's one of the things that don't make the country equal and better for investment. How do you do it, and what have you done?
Well, we were not ready for the huge increase. I mean, our population was slightly bigger than that of Panama. Now, our population, and I'm talking about the Republic of Ireland, not the full island,
yeah,
was below 4 million, was 3.5 million. Our population is now 4.34 million in most recent. Now, what has happened there, we were not ready for all these extra people. Irish people coming home again when the jobs became vacant. People from Europe coming to work in Ireland because it was attractive. And so we hadn't enough homes, and we have to build more homes. We hadn't enough roads for the new cars that people had. So the infrastructure was not ready. We didn't have good public transport. Now, we now have a national plan that we've in process of trying to work towards investing long-term in that infrastructure. That's not easy, but it's one that we've made a decision on and are working towards. One of the big problems we had, though, that in regard to this was what we call better regulation. There was a real difficulty that every time somebody in Parliament said, what about doing this? And they'd pass a law. And suddenly the amount of red tape, the amount of bureaucracy that was likely to come in, and it was getting very difficult to handle, to open a new business, even to open a new restaurant or a shop, a small shop, was becoming very difficult. So the government has focused, and I'm involved in that, on better regulation. I chair a group called Sensible Rules. And what we've said is, and we've got agreement from government now on this, before any new regulation or law comes in, there has to be an impact analysis assessment. You have to analyse the impact of this on the community. Now, that was not easy to achieve, but it has now been done. Not 100%, but almost every piece of legislation coming through, we demand an impact assessment. And it is amazing how that has worked and is beginning to work very well, not just in Ireland, but in the rest of Europe. For instance, President Barroso, who's the president of the United Europe, of the European Community, last year when he came in, he abolished 70 regulations and rules that had been made in the previous years that he said, we believe we can manage without them. Now, if they're necessary, you've got to make the case for them again. And one of the things we've tried to do in Ireland and in Europe is, and we're not fully successful, but we're making the case, is that every law you introduce should die after 5 years, unless you make a case to reintroduce it.
Sunset laws, they call it.
It's sunset laws, exactly. Now, I would love to tell you that's working, but we're still making the case. But it's an objective that we have. The other regulations, the other thing that I've argued very strongly for is, number one, speedier information. And one of the things I personally have achieved, every bill that came through into the Senate, I always said that you must publish the results before March the 31st the following year. Now, the government reluctantly, they never did this. Sometimes it was a year later before they published the results. They've agreed now, almost every bill coming through, but it took me 3 or 4 or 5 years before it began to be noticed. And I'm in Parliament now 15 years next week, and they now introduce in every piece of legislation, the results must be published within 6 months. Now, not the 3 months that I want, but it's getting somewhere, and it's a lot better than it was. So the other one is to try and consolidate every time there's a new law introduced. Let's say it's in regard to crime or law or education. You should consolidate it into the previous legislation. Because what used to happen is every time you got a new law, you had to check maybe 10 other bills dated back to the 1920s or 30s to see what is the law. Now, if you consolidate into one piece of legislation, at least you can find it. Now, we haven't achieved it 100%, but it's been listened to, and now that is beginning to take place, because I find law quite difficult. You read something and you say, let's do that, and then you discover that there's a previous law which has not been abolished. So one of the other things we've tried to achieve, and it has been done, is doing away with laws that are no longer needed. I don't know if that applies in Panama, but it certainly has been very useful in Ireland.
Many of those here. Well, I want to make a very unfair question. Well, this is the first time that you are in Latin America and you're living in Panama, which is somehow different sometimes than other Latin Americans. What would be your advice, the things we should do? After you've seen a little thing you have seen, what you have read, what would be, just you put it to me the other day, if you have a magic wand, what would you give me your magic wand for me to think we should do from
I'm very reluctant to advise, after only 3 days here, to advise you what to do. All I will say is that one of the arguments I make in Ireland is to encourage people, managers, to encourage them to go into, take an interest in government, to become involved, to be willing to run for office, and to take with them the lessons they have learned from business so that they can bring it into government. For instance, let me take the example in my business, in the supermarket business. I'm a huge believer in that the important person is the customer. Now, when I went into Parliament first, and I was in my 50s when I decided to go into Parliament, I said, I'm going in, ran for election, and then I suddenly looked, I don't know anything about this. This is my first time, what do I do? And I began to look for the customer in every bill. And when I began to look for the customer in every bill, let's say if it was education, it was the student, not the parents of the student, it was the student. When I looked for health, it was the patient. When I looked at the road traffic, it was the pedestrian or the motorist. And suddenly you began to come up with new ideas that nobody else had thought of. So I would believe that the benefit of bringing a business person and having business people say, I don't have to give up my business. I can find a way of participating in politics in some form or other. Now, I'm lucky enough to be elected as an independent member, so I didn't have to join a party, and therefore it gives me the freedom to go one way or the other. And now, I don't know if you have independent members, but we have, in the Irish Senate, there are just 6 of us out of 60. But it's a wonderful opportunity, because sometimes I support the government, sometimes I don't. Now, having that independence is useful, but even if you're a member of a party, you can argue strongly in there. So if I had only one bit of advice to give, not just to Panama, but to almost every business person around, do take an interest in what's happening. Don't say, oh, politicians are terrible, it's all their fault. Become involved, and then you can't blame anybody but yourself.
Well, Senator, thank you very much for having the time of spending with us here in Panama. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Roberto, and thank you for the coffee and the hospitality.